Hi.
How's everybody? Good.
This
Thanks
is
for coming.
intimate.
I know.
It's nice. You trudged through the New York rain.
I know. We were like, this is impressive because when it starts to rain out there.
We were talking right before we came in. First off, I have to acknowledge congratulations on your new book. And it is such an honor for me to be able to facilitate this conversation with Vienna. We go way back, which sounds like 40 but to the origins of Instagram too. So we were just talking before we came on, like, when was the last time we actually did a talk together? It was a long time ago.
Like 5.
When you and Connor first started dating.
Yeah.
Right?
So maybe 6 years ago. So,
Wow.
So excited to be here with you. Thank you for moderating. And yeah, that was funny to hear that intro today because we added Good Morning America to it, which aired this morning, which was really cool. So, but we're here to talk about the book and get into all
let's
the good
dive
things.
into it. Okay, so first off, who here has bought a copy? Okay, so room for some sales. I like that. What's that? Nice. Let's get to the origins of this book, because when Vienna, early in our relationship, I remember we were talking on the phone. I'll never forget where I was parked in rainy Vancouver, and we were talking about some pattern I had, some wonderful creative pattern, and she said, well, have you ever looked at where that came from, like in your family, in your childhood? And I was like, my childhood was great. And she was like, you could just hear this like classic, now I know it as the classic Vienna pause, where it was like, okay, yeah, we'll just let you like sit with that for a second till I bring the Pharaon punch. And it's kind of like I laugh today because I remember thinking like, I got nothing there. And then, just through friendship, exploring all that stuff, I was introduced to that I had a few things to excavate. So it is such great service, the work that you do and the writing that you do and the speaking. So let's get to the origins of what brought this book into the world and even into your work, like why you desired to explore. Not many people desire to go into the gates of their stuff, and maybe it's because you didn't know.
Well, certainly with families, right? It's challenging to look back. I think we have a lot of constraints. We're worried about opening up Pandora's box. Maybe we've gotten our relationships with our family to a place that is okay, and we're worried about changing that dynamic now. Maybe a parent is deceased, and if we go there, that feels like it's a bit too raw and open. And then I think the one that so many people share is like, my parents or the adults in my life did the best that they could with what they had. And all of that can be true and valid. And it's a distraction away from honoring and naming the pain, And I think to your point about like whatever the pattern was all those years ago, we've known each other now probably for about 10 years. It's like what I've seen in my work is that the unwanted patterns that people have in their lives, their relationships, whether it's conflict that they keep having with a partner or a parent, or whether they keep choosing emotionally unavailable people to date, for example, is like if you can't make a shift, if you can't make a change very easily, right? If this like behavioral change doesn't actually integrate, then we want to look back at the things that are unresolved in our lives. Right. And that's it. We carry so much unresolved pain from the past. I specifically focus on looking at our family systems. Obviously, there's other pain that exists as well, but I really like to look at the family systems we grew up in. What we saw, what we experienced, what we observed. We tend to find a way to survive it, right? We move through it. We just keep our eyes going forward, and we find ways to navigate life and the world and relationships. And who here has an unwanted pattern that they're like maybe would like to shift? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so for me, what I've seen, I've worked with now, I've been saying 20,000 hours for years now, so I'm sure it's more than that, but over 20,000 hours of clinical work with individuals, couples, and families. And what I've seen time and time again is that the patterns are tied to unresolved pain from our past that needs our attention. Pain is not out to destroy us. Our wounds are not here to ruin our lives, right? They are tugging at us because they want attention. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be honored and seen by us. And the patterns are its clever way, really, like almost if you externalize it a bit, right, it's like clever way of bringing us back into contact with what it is that we need to be in contact with. And yeah, so that's the work. I mean, obviously, so your example before, that was also me for a while. So I went to grad school when I guess I started when I was 21, right after undergrad. And when I entered into family systems work to become a marriage and family therapist, I was like, my parents' divorce didn't affect me at all. Promise. And like, bless my professors and teachers and supervisors. And like, this sweet girl, like, okay, she's got a lot to learn.
They're like, we're going to crack her soon.
Yeah, we're going to crack her soon. And I started, it took time, of course, and a lot of unpacking to be able to be in that space of, that was such a protective mechanism for me, right? Is like, I feel too overwhelmed to be with my pain, right? To feel my pain, right? It's much easier for me to pretend like everything's fine and I'm unaffected. And where their relationship had gotten to at that point was they were very good friends decades later. We had holidays together and they would drive together to my lacrosse games in college and we'd have holiday together. And so things presented okay at that point. But when you travel back, there was so much chaos, right? So much conflict. There was a lot of psychological abuse, a lot of paranoia, a lot of, emotional flooding. And it was so much for my system that my way of surviving it was pretending like it had not affected me. And so until I started to do that work for myself, I would find myself probably similar to all of you, right, in unwanted patterns. And I really needed to just begin unpacking the stuff in my family system to begin to create the shifts that I wanted for my life and my relationships.
Yeah, can we talk about, before we get into what are the origin wounds, can we talk about when we look back at our past, when we explore our childhood, when we're even just invited to do such a thing? Often what I'll hear people say is something like, I said, oh, it was great, or that didn't affect me, or yeah, that happened, but my mom was going through a lot, or my dad was blah, 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 blah. Like, how do we even begin to, because to me that just sounds like, I'm not even open. I can't even see that that is a possibility. And like you were saying, maybe the pain is just so much that my way of coping with being friends with a marriage and family therapist is to have a defense mechanism, right? Does anyone have friends who are marriage and family therapists? Or you just don't have one. That's a great idea too. Yeah. They're like, I'm a psychologist. And you're like, cool, we don't click. I gotta go.
So what was your question?
Yeah, like how do we even begin to, because has anyone else given those types of answers? Like, oh yeah, it's not a big deal. Or they were going through a lot. Like that's such the...
Yeah, right. It's like our wounds, I think there's the notion that your wounds have to come from this malintended place, right? That it has to come from negligence or abuse or something like that. And the reality of it is that sometimes wounds just are created, right? It's like your parents or the adults in your life who, served in that role can do the best that they can, quite literally, right? I talk about a client in the book whose name in the book is Andre, and he, as a single mom, she worked double shifts, multiple jobs, and she, he had such love, respect, admiration for his mother, just held her in such high regard. And so in our conversations, right, it was like he could really rationalize that she was doing everything in her power to prioritize him, right? It's like he could see that. But what was happening was it was keeping him from honoring the fact that there was still a prioritization wound there, right? It's like it doesn't have to come from terrible places, right? Like sometimes it's just what the outcome is when you don't get to spend time with someone, right? And so she would work double shifts. They would go to church and have brunch afterwards on Sundays, and that was their little bit of time together, which was so sacred. But Then she'd go off to her next shift. And at the end of the day, the thing that he craved for the most as a child was more time spent with her, right? And so there was this prioritization wound that was there that had developed, even though everybody could hear that story and say, oh my gosh, of course, like she's doing her absolute best, and we see that. But what happens when we create the explanations, right? When we can find a way to rationalize it, we can find a way to explain away the story, right? It is a distraction away from our healing, right? It's a distraction away from our healing. It's a distraction away from tending to that which wants to be tended to, right? And so, I think one of the questions really is the constraint question. It's like, what keeps me from being able to go there, right? Like, what does it serve for me to not go there, right?
Ooh,
because there's everything that our systems do are protective, right? And so we don't want to be harsh and critical and shameful of ourselves and, moving in this space. We want to really understand what our choices and behaviors are serving. And when we can start to see it through that lens, I think there's something that can shift, right? It's like, okay, there's a protective mechanism happening here. And, I think I share this story openly. When my now husband and I were first dating, we had gotten into a conflict. I have no clue what the conflict was about, but what I do remember vividly was that I could not stop proving my point. I could not stop needing to be right. And he's like, I got it. I hear you. I got it. And I'm still going, doubling down, tripling down. I'm like, no, but I'm really going to tell you what's up. And he's like, babe, I got it. I hear you. I understand. And I'm going. I'm having this out-of-body experience, right, where I'm like, Vienna, shut up. Like, stop. It's like not really attractive. You got to pull it back in. And, in a moment, right, this part of me that was showing up, right, is like lots of shame, lots of embarrassment, fear that it was so unattractive that maybe this person is not going to want to stay in a relationship with me if I keep behaving this way. And, pulled myself out of shame for a moment and got curious. Okay, like, what does needing to prove my point serve, right? Why am I doing that? Why do I need to be right? What is that connected to? And with a little bit of exploration, I grew up in a family system where at the time my dad was psychologically abusive and manipulative and, engaged in gaslighting, not with me directly, but with my mom. So I observed a lot of that. And I saw the impact that it had, right? It was really like crazy making, truly. And it was scary, right? It was really scary to watch and be an observer of that. And what I got really good at as a little girl was like tracking, right? I listened, I watched, I made sure that I followed every little thing so that I knew what was true and what was not true. And so when I started to get curious about this part, I realized that my need to be right was equated to safety, right? My ability to prove my point was connected to my ability to feel safe in the world, safe in this relationship, right? And that was such an aha moment for me, and I think, again, to not let shame take over too much, right? So that I can actually be like, all right, the survival mechanism at one point, right, is something that does need to evolve because the wise, mature adult self does need to show up because otherwise I am going to be in relationships where I keep doing this, I keep engaging in this pattern. Likely that will mean that relationships will keep ending because that's not workable. And so, to shift from, this like wounded part in the driver's seat to the healing part in the driver's seat where there's space to actually notice the pause, right? Of like, okay, I know where I want to go, right? What's familiar, but I now have awareness, context, understanding. I've spent time witnessing this pain and grieving. And when you do that work, which I talk about in the book, right, it makes the pause a little bit bigger so that mature adult self can actually step in and choose to engage differently. And, you know, I'm not necessarily perfect at it all the time, of course, right? But to see that shift, right, was deeply profound for me. I think any moment I've had where I've recognized how origin wounding is playing a part has been, has been really profound and quite literally life-changing for me.
Yeah, I think what's helpful in the book is that you break it down into 5 wounds. Mm-hmm. And, you know, being able, when I read it, I was like, oh, I've got a few of these. Like I'm trying to collect them, like a collection of wounds. I like them to mix together, just keep things new and fresh.
For your partner.
Mix things up for
Which
my
wound
wife.
is here
you know?
tonight, yeah.
Yeah. If she's watching online, you're welcome. I'm curious first if we can go into maybe the definition of what a wound is, and then what are they and how do they show up, and just, you know, so everyone gets more context.
Yeah, I really like the language of wound. I think we tend to use that more when we're thinking about the physical, and I think that's why I chose it, because that image of the physical wound makes a lot of sense to us, right? It's like when you're a kid, you bruise, you know, you bump your knee, there's a scrape, parent cleans it up, puts a Band-Aid on it, tells you to let some air get in there, and, you know, it starts to heal over. You take the Band-Aid off, you bump it up against the table, the scab falls off, it starts to bleed again, right? Kind of that similar sense when it comes to emotional wounds, right? Is like, even though we might not see them in the same way that we do the physical, right? There is a rubbing up against the wound that happens throughout life, right? And so again, even though there isn't the bleeding, right, outwardly, right, the sensation in our internal experience is the same. And so, yeah, I love the language of wounds, because I hope that is a bit of the image that comes for people. I talk about 5 of the origin wounds in my book. When I sat down to write, I was writing down like every possible wound of the human experience, you know, and finally was like, I think that this encompasses the majority of it. And we aren't people who fit into boxes, right? Like, this is just my language for it. But it felt like, it's like, okay, I think that we will find ourselves in these wounds. And so their worthiness, belonging, prioritization, trust, and safety. You might have a thought of which ones are yours. And yeah, you know, for some folks who got advanced copies of the book are like, is it possible to have all 5? Like, it is possible. But I imagine that you will notice that there might be a couple that really rise to the surface for you. The worthiness wound, okay. So if you grew up in a family system where you were a perfectionist, where you were a performer, we've got some nods over here, where you were the peacekeeper, the people pleaser, the straight A student, the great athlete, because there were conditions for love and connection, presence, attention, validation, peace, calm in the family, right? Like, you learned that there was a condition for that, right? And so as long as you are performing well, as long as you are presenting perfectly, as long as you are quiet enough, as long as you are bringing home the straight A's, right, then I love you, right? Like, then I'm here for you, then I'm connected to you, then you get attention and validation, right? But when you're not doing those things, then the love and the attachment and validation is gone, right? And so, yeah, so that might be the experience that you hold with a worthiness wound. The belonging wound is, anybody have a family who's like, this is how we do it in this family? You've heard that, yeah, okay. This is what we believe, this is how we operate, this is what we think, right? And the idea that if you don't do those things, you're an outsider, right? Maybe you become the black sheep of the family, right? But like, you're not a part of us unless you do as we do, right? And, you know, I think Dr. Gabor Mate talks about so attachment and authenticity really are our lifelines, right? But that when attachment is threatened, children will trade authenticity to have attachment, always. survival, right? And so it might have been in that type of a family system where you learned that you needed to trade who you are in order to fit in order to belong, in order to be a part of something. Okay, prioritization. So this is when you don't feel important growing up, right? And so maybe a parent who was a workaholic, or maybe there was other addiction in the family that took a lot of the attention and energy away from you. Sometimes it's a mental health challenge, right? Or a sibling who had an illness where a lot of the attention or focus had to go there. But also similar to what I was saying before about Andre, right? Is like prioritization wound can also show up when everything is really well intentioned, but you still don't feel like you are the priority in the way that you hope for and crave to be, right?
How about the youngest? Is that in there? Like if you're the youngest in the family? Trying to excavate more over here.
Mark, are you the youngest in the family?
Oh, yeah.
Reveal
Yeah.
yourself.
Like,
oh, look
wow.
at that.
Oh, my God. I was asking for a friend.
Asking
but
for
yeah,
a friend,
I happen to
always.
Be too.
It can be, right? And I think, sibling order and all of that stuff, right? It's like, I still like people to think about their own personal experiences, because how things play out gets internalized by all of us differently. Right? Like you could all have the same event take place and it can be internalized as a very different wound for you, right? So, that's the inquiry, is how did the experiences that I went through, the experiences that I observed, how did I internalize those things, right? How are they taking up space within me? So yes, right? It's like, maybe that's one of the
Yeah,
three
like I'll
wounds.
tell my friend later, but yeah.
Okay, the next one is trust. So yeah, that's when there's a betrayal that happens, when there's deceit or lies. Sometimes it's big stuff, or the obvious ones of like an infidelity or an affair that takes place. Parent gambling away an education fund, parents taking out credit cards in their children's names. Doesn't also always have to be, that I think sometimes feels very wild to people to hear, but it can also just be somebody promising something repeatedly and not following through on it, right? And I don't mean, okay, plans had to change and we acknowledge that, right? I mean, the repeated sense of, you keep telling me something and it's not true, I can't count on it, I can't believe it, right? And then the last one is safety. And this is a really tender one, of course. When we're talking about the absence of safety, we're also talking about the presence of abuse, right? And so we discuss physical, emotional, psychological, sexual abuse, negligence, recklessness, but overall the sense that your well-being was not cared for, considered, protected, honored, and respected as a child.
So when you begin to unpack these wounds, and as you're saying, context matters, like through the lens of your own experience, because, I'm thinking, I have a brother, he might feel not prioritized, and he'll be asking about the second child in the family. So you have context, you have the acknowledgement of it. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, right. So, obviously this is layered work. I know sometimes people are like, give me just follow these
Buy the
3
book,
steps and you
that'll
will
really
no
help.
longer be wounded. This is nuanced work, right? And it does take a bit of us to get into it. In the book, I do offer a 4-step origin healing practice. And obviously the first step would be to name and identify the wound and or the wounds. But where we go after that is like, we gotta feel, right? It's like, you gotta go into that space. The witnessing of your experience is so important. And I remember how valuable this was for me. I would visualize myself sitting, I used to perch myself at the top of the stairs in my mom's house and listen into the conflict. There was like a little opening where I could hear the conversation, that at least her side of it, and then I could kind of pick up on some of the details. And I also got very good at picking up the second phone.
Oh, that's a skill. That was a skill.
It's a skill set.
If you're too young to remember needing that.
Yeah, the landline pickup where it doesn't click, where they can't hear the click, or you just wait for them to be in high conflict. And they're like, I definitely can't hear it. But I would listen in on those things. I was a tiny little human, right? Like when I think of that, I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. And there was a real need for me to witness myself first, right? To really see this little girl who was just holding all of this. I'm an only child as well. And so there weren't other tiny humans in the space with me. Neither of my parents got remarried or repartnered, and so there weren't any other adults who would also be able to say, I know, like there was none of that. And so I was really in this by myself, and yeah, to just like close my eyes and go meet that 7, 8, 9-year-old little girl and just really see what she was going through at that time. I like really just connect with that and recognize it and acknowledge her and be with her. And of course that then leads us to grief, right? Because you are very, most of us can be quite tender with children, but to then think of ourselves as children who have gone through, I'm sure, very hard and hurtful, harmful experiences. There's a lot that can come up there. And so, yeah, the third part of it is grieving. And then it leads us to, what I was talking about before, that pause where we can start to pivot, right? When we can replace an old way with a new way, when we can actually update the behavior. In the grieving, I want to go back to the witnessing for a moment, because something that I think is really important is that you don't need the person who contributed to the wound in the first place to be a participant in witnessing. And I think it's one of the places that a lot of us can get stuck. I just want that person to get it, right? I just want them to acknowledge it. I just want them to be able to really validate this experience. And of course we do, right?
Is part of the growth of that being that you're letting go of the requirement or the need for it?
I think that the need might still be there, but I think there's an acceptance of where somebody else's limitation and block and constraint is. And that's hard because I think in our ideal worlds, right, if there's a wound with mom, you want mom to be able to acknowledge it. And you're like, okay, well, if I write it in a letter or if I say it this way, what if I try it really kind? What if I yell it at you? What way can I get you to actually see it? And this brings us to the conversation of hope. It's like hope is this really beautiful thing that serves something for a period of time. And then it hits this line where it keeps us in our suffering, right? Right? Because it's the thing that's like, well, just it could happen. Right? Maybe, right? And then we just keep looping in that space over and over and over again. And so we have to be really mindful of that. The beauty is that we don't need that person to participate in it. We just need a witness. And I like the idea of us being our own witness, but I also think because it is relationships that wound, then we need relationships to be a part of the healing. We just don't need the original person to do that. So partner, therapist, trusted friend, anybody who's sort of in your camp, but to have somebody see you in that way is very, very meaningful.
So if we're in repeated patterns in relationship, and maybe that's not just who we're choosing, but maybe the way that we navigate conflict, and we've done the process of identifying the wound, and then we're going through the steps that you're suggesting, and then we find ourselves still repeating. So does that mean that one of those steps is maybe left incomplete, or as you said earlier, that we sort of invite our soul is like, let's give him the experience again so he can grow, you know what I mean? We're like, oh, I'll just do this again so I can learn more. But is there sort of like
It can be, but we've forgotten that they too have origin wounds, right? That are also coming up, right?
Oh,
and
like
that's
our partners.
Yeah,
or
our partner is a
whoever we're
friend,
in. Yeah.
the boss, your colleague, the person on the street who you're like, it's like everybody.
You're like, I have a book for you. I don't know you, sir, but you have some stuff.
Right. It's like everyone we come into contact with, and I think that's the goal of this book is, yes, for you to see yourselves this way, but also to remember that everybody else, and obviously the people you care about and love, that's obviously we're going to be more tuned into this as opposed to a stranger. But right, the reminder that they're also bringing all of this to the table too. So yes, it might mean that we haven't done enough of something. I usually say when stuck, grieve more. When when in doubt, grieve more. Like grief is a mover, right? But we don't love to do it. We tend to reserve it for deaths, maybe.
Listening to Adele is also helpful to
yeah,
let go
or
of grief,
that.
just so you know.
And so, yes, so there might be something that's being missed or that we just haven't spent enough time. We like to move ourselves through things really quickly. It's like, well, that outcome sounds so nice, right? It's like, no.
Yeah,
you
so
must really slow down in this space and really keep giving yourself what it is that you need. And, right, the other part of that is that there is somebody else with you, again, friend, partner, parent, your adult child, your teenage, whatever, right, who also has a full history, right? And they're bringing that too. And so it's very easy to get hooked and looped back into that stuff. And so our most ideal situation is that we are both, whomever, aware and doing this work and able to name some of this together, because then you really are a team. Even the moments when things are tough, and I know that you know this with Kai, I know this with my partner, even when things are really hard, right, you can step back and you can say like, okay, I know what's happening here, right? Or like, I can sense what's showing up for you right now, right? And even if they're not there, they can't see it or name it themselves, you then have you have more grace and compassion for what's happening. Grace and compassion is not an excuse maker, right? But it is a very important piece of this. Grace and compassion, ownership, accountability, responsibility, those intersect. We need all of them, right?
So what if we are reading your book, we're doing the wound stuff, we're changing, and our partner is just not open to it, or how do we present it maybe in a way that, as opposed to like sliding the book under their pillow, like, I don't know.
Bookmarking the chapter.
Yeah. You especially like wound 2 and 4. Yeah, like, is there a way, obviously not everyone's going to be open to it, but I think often our approach maybe could use some work. So what do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a question that I think we get often, and we can, you can lead the horse to the well, but you can't make it drink water. People don't want to be forced. You can't control other people's experiences. And you also can't, it's like sometimes let me take a step back. We care about the people we care about, right? So when something's working for us and we're healing, we want them to as well, right? We're like, this is the good path, right? Like, come along. So of course it comes from this place of wanting growth and healing and evolution of the relationship. And I also think sometimes if we're talking about intimate relationships, I think there's that fear that if you don't come along, right, then we're going to grow apart, and then what's that going to lead to? And I don't like the idea of that. And so we can try to harness them to come with us. But I usually say, in response to that question, like, be the model, live it yourself, embody it. You want to talk about the things, the shifts, the changes that you are experiencing. Beautiful. Maybe that is an invitation for someone to get a little more curious about what this work is. Listen, maybe not under the pillow, but yeah, like, this book has been really helpful for me. Or listen to this podcast or read this article, and maybe somebody will engage. But, right, going back to that constraint question, and I know some people will shut this question down no matter what anyway, but, what keeps you from wanting to explore this? Like, what's actually scary about diving into this? What do you think you're protecting yourself from, right? And what does it serve for you to not go there again, right? Those questions are so helpful. Sometimes we try to brute force change, and the constraint question is a little bit gentler, right? It's like, let me understand what it serves to keep yourself from going there. Whether they're going to give you an answer, whether they have the awareness, okay, we don't know, maybe not. But those are generally the approaches that I recommend. I know that there can be grief there too, right? If somebody doesn't come along with us on the journey. But, that's part of how, it's going to unfold and play out the way that it does. And maybe we'll bring you into more grief and more healing in a different way.
What can people look forward to through doing this work? Like what's possible?
I mean, truly, I think it's that there's an internal peace that exists. The subtitle of the book is How Breaking Family Patterns Can Liberate the Way We Live and Love. I think there's a liberation there, right? It changes the way that we relate to ourselves. It changes the way we relate to others for the better. That's pretty good, right? And this internal peace component of understanding ourselves through new context, having a new lens about ourselves and others. Right? It's it really, it's not hyperbolic for me when I say it's life-changing work, right? And sometimes it's the smallest little shifts that happen that you're like, wait, what? That's how I was operating before. And then you find the opening and you do it. And you're like, this is it, right? And so, yeah, internal peace, improved quality of relationship with self and others, right? The life and the relationships that you actually want and desire to have. But it takes work. I'm not selling the just read the book and it will be done. It does require, my team is don't say that. That's not, no, but it's that's it. It's going to require work from you. But I have worked with individuals, couples, and families now, for over, tens of thousands of hours. And this is what I have seen time and time and time again. We have to go into this space. And if we can do it delicately, and I really try to hold you through this book in a very tender way, when we can do it delicately, then I think there's a lot of opportunity for beautiful change.
Is there anything that people need to know that they'll find in the book, beyond us talking about the wounds and the healing? Yeah,
because it's, I operate in a lot of nuance. It's not just do these things and then you can communicate better, or just do these things and then conflict will shift. In the third section of the book, I dive into how wounds will play out in the breakdown of communication, conflict, and boundaries. And I really love that section because it gets into the intricacies of relationship dynamics. So it's not just identify your wounds and then do this origin healing practice and that's over. It's you're going to do that and then you're going to get to practice because relationships make us practice things, right? That's what plays out. And I love that third section quite a bit because it shows you how, even though, okay, we've done all of this, but there's how we get hooked back in. And I storytell a lot in the book. I think that is one of the best ways to learn about ourselves. We see ourselves in other people, or we see our partner in someone else, or we see a child in someone else, or a sibling in someone else, or a friend in someone else. And I love that way of learning. I've seen that be really powerful and helpful for so many. So, yeah, and maybe I know we're going to open a Q&A here pretty soon. Right, but I'll leave you with maybe one of the most important questions that was ever asked of me that I also put in the book, but it's, what did you want most as a child and not get? It's and to just be in that space and see where it guides you, because my guess is it will lead you to an origin wound, right? And so when you're where do I begin, right? Where do we start? That's an important question to ask.
Way to drop a bomb on them right before Q&A.
We had to have an oof, of course.
Yeah, we do have to have an oof. All right. Ready for questions? Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you. I love the title of the book, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of little questions.
Okay.
But so clearly this is what you call inner child work.
I don't call it that. Listen, there's so much beautiful stuff that is inner child work. And I think obviously we are coming into contact with this, but this is family origin work. This is origin healing practice. Okay. And, you might feel like there's some stuff that certainly weaves into it, but I think I don't know if have you done much?
Sure.
Yeah. You will probably see some interconnectedness there, but I think you're going to experience something a little bit new.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you said that there was a time in your life, obviously, well before this, that inspired you to do this work.
Yeah.
That you created a shift in your own life. And was there a system that you were taken through that, that freed you up, that inspired you?
Yeah, so there's many moments. I think maybe the one that you were picking up on was in my late 20s, I was dating someone, and his ex came back in the picture, wanted to be back with him. He was deciding whether to go back into the relationship with her, stay in the relationship with me. I was like, take all the time you need. I understand. I'm so unaffected by this, yada, yada, yada. I know. I roll out myself too. And, I was having a conversation with Mark so many years ago, and it clicked in because it was the continuation of the role that I had taken on as a little girl, that needless little girl who became this needless adult woman and was unaffected by things, was playing the cool girl persona, right? Like, it's fine. And the therapist in me kind of came out to, is like, I get it. There's so much context. There's a lot of layers. Take all the time you need. And we were having a conversation and it clicked in, and it was in it. So it wasn't necessarily that there was this process that I went through where somebody led me through it. Okay. I think it was a history of me doing this work for a long time, but obviously there are things that we don't always see yet, or we're not quite ready to go there yet. But this was, I remember calling him up and saying, I'm not actually okay. I am deeply affected by this. This doesn't feel respectful. This was the first time I was saying those things out loud, right? And that, for someone, when you haven't said something, even when it's so simple, for maybe other people here are like, that would have been easy for me to say, but in that moment, it was this big moment of liberation. And when I say life-changing, like, it changed the course. We joke, my husband and I joke now, he's like, I didn't know that woman at all. You tell me everything you feel and when you're affected, right? But it was this big pivot in my life where, and I had to go into, I hadn't had the framework then that I do now. But when I look back, I named it, I witnessed it, I grieved it, and then there was this moment of pivot. And I talk about how, like, I don't say this in the book, but I think about cross-country skiing. I don't know if anybody's ever done it before, but when the track's there, it's still hard, but when the track's there, a little bit easier than fresh powder. And there's that moment when you have to jump into fresh powder, even though it is so much harder to do it, but to create that track for the first time. And then once you do it over and over and over and over and over again, it becomes easier and easier and easier. So yeah, thanks for asking that question and giving me an opportunity to share that story again. But yes, it was a system that I walked through. I just didn't know what it was at that point.
Okay, and just to wrap that up. So this work is actually sort of a new angle on all the old types of internal family system
like,
stuff that have
it
been
is
around
not
forever.
lost on me of all of the giants' shoulders that I, sit upon. Obviously, I have been trained in systems work for,
Right.
a long time. And so,
Yeah, okay.
yes, it's been pulled
Okay.
from,
So it's a fresh
everything kind of
approach,
exists
yeah.
already,
Yeah.
but this has been pulled from my personal and professional work with all of the people
Cool.
I've had the honor.
And then just lastly, are you thinking of doing workshops? Like,
Yeah,
making
I
people-
have I have a workshop next week with the class, which will be a movement. So it'll be a workout and afterwards a workshop. And I will also we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to be on the mic during the workout, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do. I'm going to be talking and very breathless, but we're going to try it. We're going to give it a go. And then I'll also be at the Well and Sage and Sound. So more dates and all of that. So yeah.
Is that all on ViennaFarron.com?
ViennaFarron.com, Instagram. Yeah. Thank you.
Questions, yes.
Hi, Vienna.
Hi.
So in exploring like my own wounds, just like the story you were saying, I'm the type of person who leans heavily towards understanding like they did the best that they could with what they knew at the time. So how do you balance like honoring that wound without taking it to a point of like resentment or disappointment?
Towards them?
Yes.
Resentment and disappointment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe that both can coexist. We can honor that people have absolutely done the best that they can and honor what has been internalized by us, right? Like, and honor what our experiences are. And, I think a good exercise could be just writing the sentence of what it is that you feel around the wound, and then putting a period at the end of that sentence, right? Whether that's literally writing it out or just in your own mind, and try it on and see, because your system wants to go to, but like this was the story and da-da-da-da-da, and it makes a lot of sense. And to just try to bring it in a little bit, right? To be like, I didn't feel prioritized, period. Whew, what happens? Where do you want to go, right? And like just beginning to notice that, or I didn't feel important enough, or I didn't feel safe in this environment, period. And, not the like, well, I wasn't prioritized because, they were working so hard to provide for us and da-da-da-da-da, and like, here's the whole story and explanation. It's like, yep, cool, got it, yep. And pull it back in and just be rooted in honoring and connecting to what is true for you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Perfect. At the back, and then we'll switch sides.
So is grieving forgiveness a little bit? A forgiveness of them?
Doesn't have to be.
Okay.
Nope, doesn't have to be. For some people, it might be. I probably would say it's more of like acceptance of what was, and that part is not changeable. I think like forgiveness is an interesting one. I know lots of people have lots of different takes on it, and do you have to? Well, if we had more time, I'd probably explore like what does forgiveness mean to you, or how do you define it. But and so maybe that is something for you to think about. But no, it does not have to be forgiveness towards the other person, or maybe that is later on in the grieving process. But I wouldn't say that it's your first stop with grief. Right? This is really about a full feeling, like letting yourself be fully expressed to yourself. Right? And wherever that may go, it may go, right? And if that leads you to a place of forgiveness, beautiful. If it doesn't, beautiful. Like wherever it is, just be in it, and to just notice it, and to be in contact with it. And grief, we come back into contact with it over and over and over again. You don't just grieve once, right? When I'm going through it, it's like, okay, it might be 7 days in a row, and then then you're pausing or whatever. And so it's, and what I'll say about the book, it's not like, and then you grieve. I walk you through it. And even if you have a hardcover, I made it, how when you get books and they're like, close your eyes. And you're like, then how do I keep reading? So what we did was, we guide you through, but then even if you don't have the audiobook, you can go to my website and listen to the audios of the origin healing practices, so that you can actually drop into it and allow yourself to feel what needs to be there. So, have you been trying to forgive?
No.
Okay.
I just thought when you used the word grieving, I wanted to have context around what that meant. So acceptance, and naming it, all those things.
Yeah, and really being fully expressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, wherever that takes every single one of us will likely be a bit different, and it may indeed include forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hand up. Oh, perfect.
Hi.
Hi.
Just wanted to know, how does one focus on their healing while also feeling hurt from like changing the status quo in their family, or being that person that's taking that big, doing the big work?
Yeah, it just continues to contribute to the need to grieve more. Yeah, right. When we start to step out and shake the system, right, and you become the problem or the villain, or just like, look at what you're doing, and that's common. I have always talked about family systems as like a machine, and all of us have our, we're the screw in the machine, and that's what makes the machine move and operate. And then you start to pull your screw out, and then the system starts to shake a little bit, and that's what you're describing. And to remind yourself of why you're doing the work that you're doing, it's, you know, it's some of what we were talking about before. It's like, it's sad when people aren't able to come with us to some degree, right? And they then start to blame you or criticize you. I'm not sure what your experience of it is, but, you know, yeah, it's like to continue tending to the pain that surfaces for you as that's happening. I would hope that you would have other people in your life who are supportive of this other path that you're taking. And maybe the perspective is, again, remembering that when people can't shift, right, when they need to make you the problem, right, again, that is serving something for them if they're not ready to go somewhere else. Not an excuse for what their behavior is, maybe just some context. But, you know, again, it's kind of guiding you back to your lane of what your work is, being around people who can support and love you and, you know, cheer for you and what you're doing. And then allowing yourself to come into contact with that pain. You know, it might be familiar to old pain too, or it might be entirely new, right? And, you know, I think it's just allowing yourself to process it and be with it and, yeah, come to that space of not needing to control and releasing that.
Thank you.
Just behind you, right behind. Yeah, perfect.
Hi.
Yeah.
My question is a bit similar to that one, which is along this journey of addressing your own wounds and especially getting a bit vocal about it. I would imagine there are also people in your life who felt offended or hurt that they're the source of that wound and disagree or, you know, feel a bit combative or what have you.
Yeah.
And how have you gone about, you know, navigating that?
Totally, yeah, right. So we were talking about this earlier. It's like sometimes the shame that comes up or the defensiveness or not knowing how to be, in the experience of being the contributor to something. And kind of the same answer, right, is like we can't control other people's experiences of our expression of our pain. And we have to decide whether or not we want to express it to certain people, right? Because I think, again, sometimes that's the cycle and we stay in suffering trying to get somebody to acknowledge it and see it. But I think there's this line of, you know, we have to, you know, we're mindful of protecting other people too. And I don't think the idea is I'm just going to say whatever I'm going to say. And if it hurts you, it hurt, you know. I think sometimes people are like, I don't know if I need to express everything to this person. It's just that it needs to be expressed. Right. And that goes back to, I don't need the original person to, you know, sometimes I'm going to express it to you, right? Or my partner or dear friend or my therapist. And because I know that the other person doesn't have the capacity to hear that. And I don't need them to. Right. And I think that's maturity, truly. Like, it's so hard to get to a place where I no longer need you to hear it. Right. But honor the, like, okay, what happens when, and is that something that sucks me back into being an emotional caretaker for people? Or, you know, is there a familiar place that I go in trying to protect others as a distraction away from honoring my own? So that's the only thing that I would say to that, as if you feel yourself being looped back into an old way. Yeah.
One more question right here. All right, thank you.
This question's a little bit adjacent and more about you, Vienna.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your career path, and it sounds like you started on the track to become a therapist right after college. And I'm just curious about what that looked like for you, how you fell into systems, or fell into, or chose it, discovered it. And what your career path has been since then, if you've done private practice or
So certainly motivated by my parents' divorce. I did not want to experience the same thing that they did. My first education and a lot of things, relationships, was not a good one. And so from kind of an unevolved, fear-based place, I was like, I gotta go to school for this and, you know, figure this out because I don't want to recreate it for myself. Most therapists get into this line of work, whether they know it or not, to resolve that which is not resolved, and I did not know it at that time, but, that was what was generating a lot of this. I decided to go to Northwestern because my college boyfriend was from Chicago. And truly, I literally looked for a school and I was like, great, I can be close to you this way. And I got in and was like, and their framework really aligned for me. And so I did kind of fall into it a bit. It was either going to be marriage and family therapy or sports psychology, which my aptitude test in 7th grade had told me. So I clearly it knew. And then, yeah, I came back east and I started working for a private or group practice in the city for many years. And then I started my own practice in 2012, and it's now group practice. I did not know that I would write a book. Like, it wasn't anything that I had necessarily dreamed of, but there are very many surreal moments, my book being on a Jumbotron in Times Square today as one of them, wild. And yeah, like, I've always wanted to think outside the box. That's what I'll say, is that, you know, when I went to grad school, they were like, and you will make $35,000 a year for the rest of your life. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I feel like there's got to be a way to, you know, break through that. And I was like, all right, so I'm going to just push and I'm going to challenge and I'm going to get, you know, I love this work. I love working with couples and families and individuals in this work. I love being with in retreats, right? And being with groups. Groups are amazing. I love using movement. So I would reach out to the class or Shadowbox or just like any types of movement spaces here to see if we could capitalize on the benefits of movement followed by processing, right? And so I just really loved pushing that, and I'm an author now.
That's amazing.
Wild.
Thank you.
Yeah, a new identity. So yeah, getting comfortable with that. But thanks are you in the field?
I'm considering it.
Ah,
not yet,
okay,
yeah.
beautiful. Welcome, maybe. Well, thank you.
Thank
for
you.
asking all these beautiful questions and moving us through this conversation.
An honor. And
Always.
thank you to all of you for coming. And thank you to all of you online from the comfort of your home and not walking in the rain.
Yes.
And everyone go pick up a copy of Vienna's book and please share it. Make sure you share on social what acknowledge. Maybe part of the vulnerability exercise is to share what wounds we all have, right? So thank you for writing
Thank you,
this
Mark.
book.